Winter had not arrived yet, but the land already knew it would not remain warm for long. The ground held the memory of heat only on the surface, while beneath it, the cold waited, patient and inevitable. Morning in Wyoming began with fog that lay low and unmoving, clinging to the earth as if it were trying to hide something that did not wish to be found. Eli Mercer stepped out of the house earlier than usual. The door closed behind him with a muted sound, swallowed almost immediately by the stillness. He moved without haste, pulling on his coat, adjusting his gloves, performing motions learned through repetition rather than thought. He had learned long ago that the land spoke most clearly before the day fully woke. He checked the boundaries himself. He always had. It was not distrust of others that kept him walking the fence line alone, but habit and something quieter beneath it. Solitude required fewer explanations, fewer memories. Out here, there were no witnesses to the pauses that crept into his steps, or the moments when he stood still longer than necessary. The fog thinned as he moved farther from the house, breaking into pale ribbons that drifted across the low grass. The world appeared unfinished, edges blurred, sounds dulled. His boots pressed into the soil with a familiar weight, each step grounding him in the present. Near an old fence post leaning slightly eastward, he stopped.
The tracks were shallow but unmistakable. Not cattle, not wolves. The spacing was wrong, the pressure uneven. Human. And beside them, smaller impressions, irregular and hurried, as if the one who made them had struggled to keep pace. Eli crouched slowly, resting one hand against his knee. The earth was cool beneath his fingers. The prints had not yet collapsed, their edges still sharp enough to tell a story. Whoever had passed through had not lingered. There was urgency in the way the steps angled away from the fence, cutting across land that offered no shelter. This part of the ranch lay far from roads and settlements. People did not wander here by mistake. Those who came did so with intent or desperation, sometimes both. He remained there longer than he needed to, studying the ground as though it might answer questions he had not yet formed. The fog drifted past him, briefly obscuring the tracks, before revealing them again, unchanged. The land did not erase anything quickly. It preferred to remember. A faint tightening settled in his chest. It was not fear, not exactly. It was recognition. The sense that something long buried had shifted, drawn upward by unseen hands. He rose and followed the trail. The tracks led away from the fence line, angling toward the low ground near the river basin. As he walked, the silence deepened. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. His horse remained tethered near the house, and the absence of hoofbeats made the world feel unnaturally close, every sound amplified by its rarity. The smaller footprints faltered at intervals, drifting closer to the larger ones, sometimes overlapping them. He noticed places where the stride shortened, where the ground showed signs of uneven pressure, as if weight had been shifted or carried. He did not speculate beyond what the soil allowed him to know. The trail crossed a patch of frozen grass, where frost clung stubbornly to the blades. Beyond it, the land dipped slightly, and the fog thickened again, settling heavier near the ground. Eli slowed, his senses sharpening without conscious effort. He was aware of how exposed this stretch of land was. No trees, no rock formations large enough to conceal a body. Whoever had crossed here had accepted the risk of being seen, or had not been able to avoid it. The tracks curved toward a dried-out stream bed, its edges lined with brittle reeds. He paused at the lip of the shallow channel, scanning the area before descending. Nothing moved. No birds, no distant riders, only the low hush of the fog sliding over stone and dirt.
As he followed the stream bed, a memory stirred uninvited. Another morning, another set of tracks, years ago, leading somewhere he had not followed soon enough. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the present, on the weight of his boots and the steady rhythm of his breathing.
The trail climbed out of the stream bed and continued toward higher ground. The footprints grew closer together, the smaller ones less defined. Signs of fatigue were etched plainly into the earth. Whoever had walked here had done so with dwindling strength. Eli felt the pull of inevitability, the quiet certainty that the path would lead him to something he could not undo. He did not quicken his pace. Rushing never changed outcomes. It only made them harder to carry. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, thinning into pale strands that caught on the dry grass. The land revealed itself piece by piece, reluctant but honest. With every step, the sense of intrusion grew stronger, as if the boundaries he had kept so carefully intact had already been crossed. He reached a slight rise overlooking a narrow stretch of land near the frozen remains of a creek. There, the tracks converged, slowed, and finally disappeared into a patch of trampled earth. Eli stopped. The feeling settled fully now, heavy and unmistakable. Whatever had entered his land had done so carrying more than hunger or chance. It carried a past that did not intend to stay buried, and a future that would not pass quietly through. He stood there in the thinning fog, aware that the stillness around him was no longer empty. The land had spoken, and for the first time in years, he knew that listening would cost him something he had long believed was already gone. He found them closer to midday, where the land dipped toward a dried creek bed that still held a narrow ribbon of ice clinging stubbornly to shadow. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the pale sky, washed thin and colorless, and the cold had settled deeper into the ground. The tracks ended there, not abruptly, but with the quiet exhaustion of people who had gone as far as they could. The woman sat on the frozen earth with her back against a low bank of dirt and stone. She held a small child tight against her chest, her arm curved protectively, her body angled to shield the smaller frame from the wind. The child did not cry. There was no movement beyond slow breathing, shallow but steady. Nearby, an older child stood a few steps away, feet planted firmly despite boots that were too thin for the season. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on the open land as if expecting something to emerge from it. He watched the world the way adults did when they had learned too early that waiting could be dangerous. Eli stopped before stepping closer. He took in the scene without hurry, letting his eyes move from the woman to the children, then to the ground around them. There was little scattered nearby, a bedroll worn nearly flat, a canteen with a cracked seam, a small bundle of clothes folded with care rather than convenience. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary.
2 narrow wooden crates rested beside the creek bed, placed parallel to one another, as if arranged deliberately. They were wrapped in coarse cloth and secured with leather straps pulled tight enough to crease the fabric beneath. The wood was darkened from use, the corners reinforced, the lids sealed with care. They were not the sort of containers meant for supplies gathered in haste. Whatever they held had been chosen long before the journey began. The woman shifted slightly when she noticed him, but she did not rise. Her movements were slow, measured, conserving what little strength remained. Her face bore the marks of travel and strain, skin drawn tight over bone, lips pale from cold. Yet her eyes were clear. There was no confusion there, no pleading, only assessment, calculation. She watched him the way someone watched weather rolling in, knowing it could either pass harmlessly or destroy what little shelter remained. The older child stepped half a pace closer to her, positioning himself between her and the open land. The gesture was instinctive, protective, practiced. Eli recognized it without needing to name it. He had seen it before, long ago, in places where children learned too much from watching and not enough from being spared.
He approached slowly, careful not to startle them. The frost cracked softly beneath his boots, the sound sharp in the still air. The woman's grip tightened briefly around the smaller child, then eased when nothing followed his movement but distance closing. He crouched a few steps away, lowering himself to their level, though he said nothing and expected nothing in return. Up close, the signs of wear were more apparent. Her hands were chapped and raw, nails broken, knuckles scraped and healing poorly. The child she held was light, far too light for the age Eli guessed, bundled in layers that had once been warm, but now served mostly as memory. The older child's face was set in a way that suggested he was holding something back, a readiness that had nowhere to go. Eli's gaze returned to the crates. He did not touch them, but he noted the way the woman's body angled subtly toward them, even as she sheltered the child. They mattered, not as tools or trade goods, but as something closer to obligation. Responsibility carried across miles of land that offered no forgiveness. The wind shifted, pulling at the edges of coats and loose fabric. The ice along the creek gave a faint sound, a thin, complaining crack that echoed briefly before settling again. Time moved on without regard for decisions still unmade. Eli straightened slowly. He had come this far following signs he had not meant to find, and standing there now, the choice felt less like one he was making and more like one already set in motion. He could leave. The land allowed it. No law would name him for walking away. But the weight in his chest, familiar and unwelcome, told him that turning back would follow him longer than any consequence of staying. He moved back toward his horse, untying it without haste. The animal shifted its weight, sensing the change in purpose, the unspoken direction of what came next. Eli led it closer, positioning it so the woman could see the offer without needing it explained. He helped them rise when their legs failed them, steadying the older child when the ground betrayed him, lifting the smaller one without comment. The woman gathered the few belongings they had brought, tying them together with hands that shook only when she thought no one noticed. The crates were loaded last, secured carefully, placed where they would not shift or strike against one another during the ride.
The journey back was slow. Eli kept his pace measured, choosing paths that avoided rough ground, guiding the horse where the earth was most forgiving. The woman rode behind him, holding the child close, her chin lifted just enough to stay alert. The older child walked part of the way, refusing the saddle until fatigue claimed him, and even then he slept lightly, waking at every change in motion. The ranch came into view beneath a sky that had begun to dull toward evening. The house stood as it always had, plain and weathered, unchanged by the passage of years that had reshaped the man who lived within it. Smoke did not yet rise from the chimney. The place felt suspended between states, neither fully empty nor truly inhabited. Eli brought them inside without ceremony. He did not explain his reasons, not to them and not to himself. He moved through familiar motions, lighting a fire, setting water to warm, laying out blankets that had gone unused for too long. The house absorbed the presence of others quietly, as if it had been waiting for sound to return. He told himself it was about the children, about the cold and the distance to the nearest settlement. He told himself he would have done the same for anyone. But as he watched the woman settle near the fire, her posture easing only slightly, he understood the deeper truth he did not voice. He had seen the signs and chosen not to look away. This time, he had followed them all the way home.
The house had long grown accustomed to solitude. Dust lay undisturbed on shelves and window ledges, settling into corners where light rarely reached. The air carried the faint scent of old wood and ash, and every movement across the floor sent a measured creak through the beams, as if the building itself were announcing the presence of anyone who dared disturb its quiet. Eli had lived within that silence for years, letting it shape his days and blunt his nights. The woman, whose name he learned was Hannah, moved through the space with careful restraint. She arranged the children near the hearth and along the walls, as though preparing for departure rather than rest. Blankets were folded with precision. Shoes were set close to reach. Nothing was spread wider than necessary. The habit of leaving lingered in her posture, in the way her eyes returned again and again to the door, as if measuring how quickly it could be opened. During the daylight hours, the crates remained untouched. They sat against the far wall, wrapped and bound, their presence acknowledged only by the space left around them. Hannah kept herself occupied with the children, tending to them quietly, restoring small measures of warmth and order where she could. She accepted food and water without hesitation but without comfort, as if such things were temporary and not to be trusted.
Night altered the house. When darkness settled and the fire burned low, the stillness deepened into something more watchful. Eli lay awake through much of it, listening to the familiar sounds of the structure shifting with the cold, the distant wind pressing against the walls. He did not announce his wakefulness. Habit had taught him that silence could be worn like a shield. It was then that Hannah moved. The faint sound of fabric shifting reached him first, followed by the careful scrape of wood against wood. He remained still, his breathing steady, his gaze half-lidded. The dim light of a single lantern bled into the room, casting elongated shadows that stretched and recoiled with each small movement. She knelt beside one of the crates and loosened the leather straps with deliberate slowness. The lid lifted just enough to reveal what lay beneath, before she paused, listening, weighing risk against necessity. Satisfied, she opened it fully.
Eli saw the contents by chance, though chance had little to do with it. His eyes adjusted to the low light, catching the pale edges of folded paper, the worn surfaces of documents handled many times. He did not move closer. He did not need to. Maps lay layered atop one another, their creases darkened from use. Lines had been drawn and redrawn, borders marked with careful precision. Names filled the margins, written in different hands, some neat, others rushed and uneven. Alongside them were receipts and contracts bearing official seals, their language formal and unyielding. He recognized the insignia of land offices and the stamp of a railway company whose reach had grown faster than its reputation. More pages followed. Records of parcels transferred under pressure. Notes detailing refusals and the consequences that followed. Locations where families had once lived, marked now with symbols that meant absence, loss, silence enforced by distance or death. Hannah handled each document with care, her fingers lingering as though committing every line to memory once more. She did not weep. She did not hesitate. There was purpose in the way she worked, and fatigue only sharpened it.
Eli understood then what she had carried across the land. These were not papers meant to protect property. They were proof of theft dressed as progress, evidence of men pushed from their homes and erased when they resisted. He had seen it before, years earlier.
There was nothing left to stand on. He had watched, and he had said nothing. The memory returned with unwelcome clarity. The faces, the meetings held behind closed doors, the promises made quietly and broken loudly. He remembered the moment he chose silence, believing it would keep him safe, believing it would keep the violence at a distance. It had not saved anyone. It had only taught him how to live with the weight of knowing. Now the weight sat in his house, bound in wood and leather.
Hannah replaced the documents carefully, stacking them as they had been, securing the crate once more. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. shoulders sagging under a burden no rest could ease. For a moment she remained there, head bowed, hands resting on the lid, as if drawing strength from what lay beneath. Eli turned his gaze away before she noticed him watching. He closed his eyes and let the darkness return, though sleep did not follow. The house settled again, the quiet closing in as it always did, but it no longer felt empty. By morning, the choice he had avoided for years stood waiting for him, patient and unyielding. The past had found him again, and this time it had brought names, maps, and the unmistakable shape of truth. Silence, he knew, would cost more than it ever had before.
They left before dawn, while the land still held its breath and the sky had not yet decided on color. The fire was smothered, the house secured in silence, nothing taken that could not be carried without slowing them down. The ranch faded behind them as they moved eastward, its outline dissolving into the low gray of early morning. Leaving was not an act of choice, but of recognition. What waited if they stayed would arrive sooner than mercy. The plains opened wide almost immediately, offering no cover and no comfort. Grass stretched thin and brittle beneath the cold wind, the earth hard and unyielding under hoof and boot. Every movement felt exposed, as though the land itself were watching, indifferent to their passage. The horizon stayed distant, a line that never seemed to draw closer, no matter how long they traveled toward it. Eli rode with the quiet vigilance of someone who knew what it meant to be followed. He scanned the ground whenever they paused, reading signs the way others read weather. It did not take long before the first marks appeared, subtle but unmistakable. Hoofprints too fresh to belong to passing traders, tracks that mirrored their own path with deliberate precision. The distance between them narrowed by degrees, enough to be felt even when unseen.
They did not speak of it. Acknowledging pursuit did nothing to lessen its reality. Instead, they adjusted their pace, choosing longer routes that cost time but offered fewer straight lines. Nights were kept brief and restless. Fires were small, shielded when possible, and extinguished early. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the slightest sound carried across open ground. The land grew harsher as the days passed. Wind scoured the plains, lifting dust and dry grass into the air, stinging eyes and skin alike. The children moved more slowly, their endurance tested by cold and distance. Hannah watched them constantly, measuring their strength, deciding when to press forward and when to stop despite the risk of delay. The encounter came without warning, as such things often did. A convergence of paths, a moment where caution met inevitability. Eli reacted before thought fully formed, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. The violence was brief and brutal, shaped by urgency rather than strategy. When it ended, the plains returned to stillness, as if nothing had disturbed them. Eli remained standing only through force of will. Blood darkened his coat along the side, seeping through cloth and into the cold air. The injury slowed him, weakened his grip, narrowed his focus. He rode on, refusing to fall, until even stubbornness failed him.
Hannah did not hesitate. She took control with the same steady resolve she had shown since the beginning. She guided the horses, redistributed the weight of their belongings, and bound Eli's wound with practiced efficiency. Her hands shook only once, and only briefly, before steadiness returned. Fear did not leave her, but it no longer dictated her movements. The children followed her lead, their own fear shaped into quiet obedience. They learned when to walk and when to ride, when to ask for water and when to save it. Their trust settled into her, like a responsibility she neither questioned nor resisted. Eli drifted in and out of awareness as they moved. In his moments of clarity, he saw her ahead of him, shoulders squared against the wind, her posture unchanged by exhaustion. She carried more than the physical burden now. She carried direction. Days blurred together, marked only by changes in terrain and the gradual weakening of his body. The plains gave way to rougher ground, low ridges that offered momentary cover before opening again into exposed stretches. Each mile pressed the truth deeper into him. He could no longer lead them the way he once had.
Between him and Hannah, something shifted. It was not spoken and did not need to be. Trust formed in the quiet exchange of responsibility, in the way she checked his wound before tending to the children, in the way he watched the horizon even when his strength failed him. Fear bound them together as tightly as purpose. Neither could turn back without dooming the others. The road stripped away distance between strangers, roles blurred, replaced by necessity. What remained was the simple understanding that stopping meant more than rest. It meant surrender. So they kept moving. The land offered no promise of safety ahead, only the certainty that staying still would end everything they carried with them. And in that relentless forward motion, they became something more than people thrown together by chance. They became those who could no longer afford to stop.
They reached the town at the foot of the mountains as the weather turned sharper, the air thinner and colder than the plains behind them. From a distance, the place appeared settled and orderly, with solid buildings pressed close together as if for mutual protection. Smoke rose straight from chimneys, and the streets carried the illusion of routine. Yet beneath that surface lay tension, the kind that gathered wherever land, money, and silence had long shared the same rooms. Eli felt it immediately. Safety here depended on names and alliances, not walls or laws. The town had learned to look away when necessary, to call survival by another name. Hannah sensed it as well, her movements careful, her attention divided between the children and the people who watched them pass. They stayed only long enough to do what had brought them there, knowing that delay would work against them. The building that housed the land office stood apart from the rest, its structure heavier, more deliberate, as if meant to remind anyone who entered of authority and permanence. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old paper. Time seemed to move differently there, slowed by records and regulations stacked in quiet defiance of the outside world. The boxes were placed on the table without ceremony. When the bindings were loosened and the contents spread out, the room changed. Paper after paper revealed patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Maps traced borders that shifted without consent. Receipts carried names that appeared too often to be innocent. Signatures tied respected men to actions carried out in shadow, and stamps made those actions official. The documents spoke with a clarity that years of fear had failed to erase. What had been whispered in fragments now formed a complete shape. Resistance followed quickly. Questions were raised that did not seek answers. Procedures were cited with sudden urgency. There were attempts to delay, to misfile, to bury the truth beneath process and politeness. But the volume of evidence refused to be contained. Each page supported the next, creating a weight that could not be lifted or ignored without leaving visible marks. Hannah stood at the center of it, no longer defined by flight or exhaustion. The danger had not left her, but it had changed form. She was no longer running from pursuit. She was standing in its path. What she carried was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every name written in careful ink, to every boundary redrawn without mercy. The children waited nearby, quiet and watchful, sensing that this place held a different kind of threat. Eli remained close, his presence steady but unobtrusive. He understood that his role here was not to lead or to speak. It was to remain, to be seen choosing the same side, even when walking away would have been easier. The town could not pretend ignorance any longer. Word moved faster than expected, slipping through offices and into streets. The truth, once exposed, resisted being forced back into darkness. It demanded response, and with that demand came consequences that could not be fully controlled. Eli felt the weight of his past lift in small, unfamiliar ways. He was not redeemed by proximity, nor transformed into something he was not. But he had not turned away. For the first time in years, his silence had ended before it became complicity. Whatever followed would not be clean or simple. Papers did not stop bullets, and truth did not guarantee safety. Yet standing there, with the evidence laid bare, and no pretense left to hide behind, he knew that choosing to stay had altered something fundamental. It was not heroism that steadied him. It was the absence of shame.
Time moved forward without announcement. Winter loosened its hold inch by inch, retreating from the hills and low valleys as early spring took its place. Snow lingered only in shadows and along the northern slopes, feeding the ground with slow patience. The earth remained hard and demanding, but it was no longer closed to life. Eli's ranch appeared again among the hills as the roads dried and the grass began to show through in thin, stubborn lines. The land looked much as it always had, shaped by wind and neglect, marked by fences that had learned to bend rather than break. Yet something subtle had changed. Near the house and along the worn paths, new tracks pressed into the soil. Smaller footprints crossed the yard, uneven but deliberate, testing the ground and finding it steady enough to trust. Hannah and the children stayed. Not because they owed him anything, and not because there was nowhere else to go. They remained because the place allowed something they had not felt in a long time. Here, the days did not demand constant readiness to flee. The horizon did not feel like a threat. The land asked for work and respect, but it did not ask them to disappear.
Eli returned to his routines as spring settled in. Mornings began with familiar tasks shaped by weather and necessity. Fences were repaired where winter had weakened them. Animals were tended with steady hands and practiced attention. The rhythm of labor filled his hours, grounding him in what could be done rather than what had already been lost. His body still carried reminders of the road. The injury had healed, but not cleanly. Some mornings brought stiffness and dull pain that lingered longer than it should have. He accepted it without resentment. It was a record written into flesh, a reminder of movement rather than stagnation. The nights changed more quietly. The house no longer closed in on itself after sunset. Lamps burned longer. The sounds of life carried through the rooms, soft and unforced. Footsteps passed where there had once been only echoes. The silence that remained was different now. It was not absence. It was rest. Hannah moved through the days with a calm that did not depend on certainty. She learned the land the way she had learned the road, observing before acting, listening before committing. The children followed her lead, exploring carefully, gaining confidence with each passing week. The ranch did not transform them, but it gave them space to recover what had been taken. The past did not vanish.
It remained in distant conversations, in unresolved consequences, in the knowledge that some truths once uncovered never fully settle. Eli knew that what they had set in motion would continue to ripple outward, beyond his reach and beyond his control. But the past no longer dictated his every step. It no longer demanded silence as payment for survival. He found that staying present required more courage than leaving ever had. There were moments when memory surfaced without warning, when old choices pressed against him with familiar weight. Yet those moments passed more easily now. They no longer defined him. They existed alongside new days, shaped by work, shared space, and quiet understanding. Redemption did not arrive as a single act or a public reckoning. It came gradually, through consistency and proximity, through choosing not to turn away, through allowing others to share the ground he had once used to hide. The land did not forgive, it did not forget, it accepted. And in that acceptance, life continued without ceremony, steady and unremarkable, in the best possible way. If this story carried you all the way to its end, if you felt the dust underfoot and the weight of choices that could not be undone, support the channel Dust and Devotion Tales with a subscription. Here, every story is a road worth walking to the very end.